Gwen Burt. I am the Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University, and I'm the past president of the BC Library Association. And on behalf of the BCLA and Public Library InterLink, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening with Micheal Vonn, focusing on libraries and intellectual freedom. BCLA and Public Library InterLink are sponsoring this event to provide the library community with an opportunity to talk about an issue that is so critical to libraries and to librarians. It's both enduring and very current in our community right now. Last year, during my term as president of BCLA, one of the activities of the board was to create mission, vision, and value statements for the association. Any discussion of core values for libraries, librarians, or our associations will always include intellectual freedom. BCLA's statement to this effect, as endorsed by our membership, reads, BCLA upholds the principles and objectives of intellectual freedom, including the right to seek, receive, hold, and disseminate information from all points of view as an essential tenet of a democratic society. This evening, Micheal Vonn will talk about the intersections of multiple community goods and the role of public institutions in balancing their commitments to the community. Micheal met with the BCLA board for a discussion about these issues earlier this fall, and we were all impressed by the depth and subtlety of her understanding of the issues. Speaking for myself, I felt like I went away substantially smarter about these complicated questions than I was when I came into that room. Micheal Vonn is a lawyer and has been the policy director of the BC Civil Liberties Association since 2004. She has been an adjunct professor at UBC in the Faculty of Law and in the I School, where she has taught civil liberties and information ethics. She's a regular guest instructor for UBC's College of Health Disciplines, Interdisciplinary, Elected, and HIV/AIDS Care, and was honored as a recipient of the 2010 Accolades Award for Social and Political Advocacy benefiting communities affected by HIV/AIDS. She's a frequent speaker on a variety of civil liberties topics, including privacy, national security, policing, surveillance, and free speech. And after her comments this evening, Dale Lauber, a trustee from the New Westminster Public Library, will facilitate questions among the group at the end. And I also just wanted to mention that this event is being filmed and will be put up on the BCLA YouTube channel, and the link will be sent out on the BCLA list. So please join me in welcoming Micheal Vonn. Thank you.
Thanks lots. Job one, I think, is to congratulate the BC Library community in its work around this issue. I can't tell you how impressed I am. For one, we got a call from the Vancouver Public Library asking for a consultation with us. And you may know the BC Civil Liberties Association, we're just public busybodies, right? We don't certify anything. We have no awards to give out in terms of you're doing it right, you're doing it wrong. We just say in the media or in our submissions to government, what are the good ideas on the basis of our analysis. So that being asked to consult before something hits the news or before there's a problem is a great privilege for us. To share our thinking, to hear what the issues are. So we did that with the library. Then we got a call from the BC Library Association saying, hey, we saw some of this, can we have a word with you? So then we had another meeting, and that was great too. And what I want to say about the conversations that we've had so far, from my perspective, is that that's what they are. They are conversations. And I'm starting to think, as a public advocate, that one of the things that the world needs now is maybe a little less advocacy. Insofar as advocacy boils down to public yelling, we hear a lot of that. And I'm less interested about defending a position, be it ours or anyone else's, that I'm tasked with defending, than trying to get most of the people in the room on the same side of the table as us, trying to figure it out. So, as I say, I'm greatly impressed by the discussions we've been having. Not just the respectfulness of them, but the constructiveness of them. And it seems to me and you let me know if I'm wrong here, that we kind of are mostly, in my discussions so far, on listservs and in meetings, etc., on the same side of the table. We're trying to figure it out. And what we're trying to figure out is a classic civil liberties problem. And the classic problem in civil liberties is that there's more than one good. So the question is always, how do we fit them together? So as civil libertarians, we have a raft of things that we defend. We defend things that we say are the fundament of a full and robust democracy. So freedom of speech and intellectual freedom, right up at the top of the list, right? But with a whole lot of other public goods. So the question of how you fit this together, we have a model for this, really, we could say, in how we go about assessing charter rights, for example. Now, I went to law school before I figured out that the charter actually only applied to government, right? Like, you have no freedom of expression with your parents, with your boyfriend, you get that, right? It's like, oh, just to the government? Okay, well, that's kind of, a lot more limited than I thought. So I learned that. The next thing that I learned is that Section 1 of the Charter says, by the by, none of these rights are absolute. And again, when you think about it, that makes sense, because they've got to fit together somehow. So there's a test. It's called the Oakes test, and it comes from a case called Oakes, where the court first makes an attempt to set out an analysis for how you're going to adjudicate all of these various goods. Not to say that there aren't rights that get violated, but what is a justification for when a right is necessarily violated? Or what are the limits? Where do the lines fit together? So we have a model, and in essence, I would say that we often turn to at least those kinds of principles when we ask ourselves, how should this fit together? And what I'm most interested in, I would say at this juncture in my work as a civil libertarian, is not defending what we come up with necessarily as a position. Because, gotta tell you, civil libertarians disagree about this stuff all the time, right? We don't always agree. We're not sure sometimes where the line should be drawn. But what I think is really important is that we participate with people who are trying to use the tools to have these kinds of discussions, to figure it out. We might not always draw the line in exactly the same place, but it would be good to have the tools to have the discussion, because we're going to make these calls all the time. They're not going to go away. It's going to be difficult to fit things together constantly. We've got a long track record of that. It's not going to get any easier. So what I'm keen to do is to give you a little bit of insight into how we went about listening to the concerns that were brought to us, talking through and thinking through what we thought were the competing values, and how we came to the circumstance where we said, yeah, we think this is okay enough for where we are at right now. That's a pretty tepid endorsement, right? But again, we're not in the business of endorsing, and we know that these are going to be difficult lines to draw. So it was as good a solution as we could help create. And part of our guarantee, if you will, in terms of where we stand on this is, we're up for a better solution. If people have better ideas, we would like to think that we're prepared to say, we'll take what you got on that and make it where we think this should go. But at the moment, we haven't seen a better solution. So if you got one, we want to hear it. Where we came to where we are at in this question was, and I assume you all know the framework, but I better walk you through it in case you don't. The issue is the Vancouver Public Library new internet policy. And boil it right down to the bug there of it. The prohibition or declining to allow usage for sexually explicit imagery in computers that are used in the library. That was really what we were asked to come in on to have a discussion about. So, I'm going to walk you through a little bit about where we start in terms of first principles and how we would envision this. and then you can see if this matches up with kind of how you might do the analysis. I'm very fond of explaining that before I was a lawyer, when I was an advocate in the community, I worked in HIV before I went to law school, I used to love telling people what the law was, always, because I knew, right? I knew. It's like, hey, you can't do that, that's discrimination, that's against the law. They always talk about the law, right? Then I went to law school, and now all I can say is, I don't know, it depends. So it's shocking, really, the way this actually works out, right? And so, you know, when you approach a topic, right? When you approach a topic like this, you think you know, coming in the front door, hi, we're the freedom of speech people, we know where we're going on this, but you don't actually. You don't actually, because first you got to figure out, what are you dealing with? Remembering that there's more than one good. So, we would start our analyses like this. I'm gonna give you a framework from another example, and it's the one that I used on the listserv, just so you can see it kind of to one side, and then we'll move it over to the library scenario. To one side, giving you an example of where there's more than one good. Medical privacy, home of my heart, is clearly a public good. A public good, not just a private good, a public good. It allows people to use the healthcare system. So, what do you do when that's one public good, and so is fighting crime? And there may be a reason why the police need access to a medical record, right? The analysis goes like this. The healthcare practitioner needs to privilege patient privacy because their professional ethics require that, which is not to say that there never could be a scenario in which the access by the police isn't a weightier value in an individual scenario. So, we don't want that analysis done by the healthcare provider. Because their job, their ethics, their professional conduct needs to be focused on the patient. So we say, hey, nice police officers, don't you be talking to that nurse. You get a warrant. That's the appropriate way that we do this. Not you and the healthcare provider are going to work this out. You're going to take your evidence to a neutral arbitrator who's going to employ a standard, and then on the rare occasions where this triumphs that, we have a process, right? But it's not a process that takes place internally within the healthcare system, because their job is to privilege the care of their patients and the safeguarding of their information. So that's an example of where two public goods, you work out a system and you make clear whose roles are who. Right? You don't constrict, you don't shrink the analyses and say that one person needs to do it. This is too important. You need to take it outside, neutral arbitrator. Two different entities with different aims. So that's the way we would do that one. It's an easy one. I put it as an example because it's easy, right? Everyone knows that part. Done. So here in the library context, we have the scenario where we're being asked, viewing sexually explicit images, and can I just say right off the bat, we're not happy with this language, sexually explicit. We just can't come up with any better language, right? Again, if you've got better wording for this, we'll know. Sexually explicit images, porn in the vernacular, right? The use of that in a library has long been controversial. Long, right? Not anything new there. And in the course of the history of libraries in this subject, there's been a huge push by librarians, library associations, etc., to ensure the availability for those materials, as offensive as they are to others, to ensure their availability. Because that's the library ethic. And it is appropriate that we privilege intellectual freedom, freedom of expression, which includes the freedom to receive information as well as to speak it or express it yourself. To be able to receive that information is also part of your expressive right. So it's appropriate that libraries would privilege that. And to our analyses, if that were the scenario in and of itself, it's kind of, we're almost at the end of the analysis here. But the problem, or the kind of complexifying factor is that the presentation that was made to us was that there were people in the library whose use of the library was being chilled or constrained, not because somebody else's viewing of material, but because they were exposed to it in ways that were not the case with paper, were not the case when those computers were much more segregated. That the issue was not one of, are you allowed to read an offensive book? Again, that's an easy one, right? We're going to stock it, you're allowed to read it, you can take it home. The question was one more of access to the space and access to the service, because now in our analyses, in the presentation that was made to us, there were user groups within the library, both of whom we have an obligation to serve, who were in conflict with each other. So as an access issue to the library, not a privileging of intellectual freedoms one over another, but as an access issue. How do we accommodate two user groups in the library who have this conflict? So, again, this is not a completely novel kind of question. You start with spatial fixes, if you got them, right? And we've been using this for a long time. Again, this is not new, right? The standard spatial fix has been privacy screens on computers. Again, just trying to isolate that usage so that it is not something that affects the public space in the same way. Now again, one of the things that came up, and I'm not sure it's a perfect analogy, but I think there's something to it. It's like, it's one thing to say, you know, we carry erotic materials. But it is true, arguably, or many people think, feel free to disagree with any of this. This is, again, our analyses here, not, you know, universal truth I'm spouting here. Our thinking on this. It is true that it's one thing to read erotica anywhere in the library where you have your reading material here. It would be different if you were to turn it face out with, say, the centerfold out and walk around the library, right? Again, the exposure in terms of other people's ability to be in that space, comfort in that space, comfort allowing their children to be in that space, arguably does change. So part of the issue is, how can you isolate? How can you get a spatial fix? How can you keep it more analogous to having the book and being allowed to have the book, or allowed to have your material, your expressive material, with you in some kind of more contained space? So we would prefer a spatial fix, either screens or computer, an area in which there's a more kind of discrete usage area, etc. Spatial fix would be ideal. We have heard various people, not just the Vancouver Public Library, tell us that their opportunities for spatial fixes are constrained. They're constrained because of the configuration of their library. They've lost their budgets for things like screens, because every time you get a new computer, the screen configuration changes. There's a money component to this. So various things have impeded the ability for spatial fixes to happen, although we don't want them written off, because we think, in terms of how you would balance this, that a spatial fix would be best. If you have no opportunity for a spatial fix, where do you go next? Well, if you don't have a spatial fix, then you're into some kind of substantive constraint. And that's the last place that you want to go. So if you were going to be making a constraint on the kinds of usage, then you want it to be as narrow as possible. What does narrow look like? Well, we were challenged with that question because, as you've just heard me tell you, we could not come up with better language than sexually explicit, and that sucks, right? It is not great language. It doesn't get to the essence of it. But the problem is, to get to the essence of it is going to be at least a page worth of text, right? What's our fear? Our fear is, one, we don't want to chill. And two, there's all kinds of things that we would say don't fall into that category that may necessarily involve sex, right? We don't want somebody to be chilled from using, the queer sexual health website. We don't. But how do we say that in language that is readily explainable and part of the policy? Well, we could have a handout that kind of outlines a little bit more of this. We could have a policy about staff's use of discretion around making sure they err on the side of being the least restrictive always. We could discuss a lot of ways that we could help mitigate that. But an actual restriction on content is the least desirable of all the options. It may be the only one available if the spatial fixes don't work. And again, this is all predicated on the idea that you're kind of with us along the road here of believing that this is an access issue for 2 user groups. And you may not. You may say, we don't see it that way. We just see it as flat out censorship issue. Right? We don't buy the argument that there's a user group who is chilled or constrained by this kind of usage in the library. Again, we have a little bit, from our perspective, which is an outside perspective, of a lacuna of evidence. What we have is we have people bringing forward representations about their experience. This is what happens in our libraries. Here's what people are saying. Here are the concerns that are brought forward to us. And I don't want to paint this as we always, or indeed almost ever, capitulate to people's complaints. Miriam Moses, who I taught with at SLACE, we spent one whole class on de-escalation techniques, fortifying our librarians with tools for basically talking people down from not taking the book off the shelf when they asked you to. Right? No, you're going to stand up to complaints that aren't meritorious. We don't care if they're complaints. The question is, do they have any merit? And from our perspective, the notion that we only have one bank of computers, and it is not age restricted, that younger people, older people, all people, really this is the one that we have, and it has to serve the general public. And we have evidence that some people are not feeling able to use this for a reason that we don't think is ridiculous. That's the kind of evidence that we represent. Again, I'm not sure that this is ubiquitous throughout all libraries, that different libraries in different communities haven't had different experiences, but this is part of the formulation of what we were presented with. And again, this evidence is anecdotal. We don't have a lot of other kinds of evidence to go on. But one of the discussions that we had was, if this is not an unreasonable, from a civil liberties perspective, vantage point to take, that we need to accommodate as best we can to user groups and keep this content restriction as narrow as possible, to use it as judiciously as possible, to make sure we're erring on the side of not chilling, if at all possible. If we do all of those things, again, from our perspective, we said that might be the best you can do within the constraints of what you have available. So, 1, spatial fix if you got it. 2, narrowest possible content restriction. And then all the provisos on please evaluate, please adjudicate, please ensure that you are providing materials that make it very, very clear that you are going to err on the side of not trying to chill, if at all possible. We were hopeful that some materials would actually be put together to talk through for anybody who is interested, just a little unpacking this notion of that very unsatisfactory term, sexually explicit. Again, like I said, looking for ways to make that more explicitly clear, because it's not clear. It's too subject to interpretation. And then we get to the further question of, and who exactly is the adjudicator? Who is it? And from our perspective, we are hopeful that it will be librarians who have the professional obligation to privilege intellectual freedom and the kind of background to stand firm on making sure that they are not being unduly influenced by non-meritorious complaints, as opposed to, say, security personnel, who might be all too readily able to respond to a non-meritorious complaint, and the chill will start to happen very quickly, right? So those kinds of practical implementation issues also key if we're going to see this be the balancing that we are hopeful of. So evaluating it, looking to see if there are, again, future fixes that present themselves. And again, just, I'm going to say it one more time, for preference a spatial fix, so we can get away from this sense of having a content restriction. But from our perspective, as I say, with the notion that the spatial fixes were difficult. Again, we can ask ourselves, how difficult is difficult, right? What standard do we use when we ask about difficult? Well, for a disability accommodation, we say undue hardship, right? Maybe something along those lines, adopt a kind of a standard. We don't want to impose upon a library an undue hardship. If there isn't a spatial fix available, this could be an alternative. I don't know, those are standards that, again, exist in the law or in an analysis, a policy analysis that might be borrowed. But that's where we came to in terms of this particular issue. So as you walk through this, if you were going to say, borrow a Section 1 analysis. Section 1 analysis has very many parts, but basically it all boils down to, in the end, a kind of a reasonableness test, right? What are you getting for what are you giving up? Is it the least restrictive means that you have for achieving this balancing exercise? That's the analysis in a nutshell. Are you doing the least restrictive thing that is reasonable? Not that it's hypothetical and nobody could actually ever achieve, but that it's actually doable. Is it reasonable? Does it turn its mind to how to ensure the right in its most full expression in the context of this competing good? That's essentially the analysis. So it's not that complicated to, I mean, you could snap off the test very readily. Here's what you're going to do. But it's hard to do in real life, right? Where you have to say, well, now we have to adjudicate all the factors. Do we have this? Do we have that? Do we have money for this? Do we have the space? Do we have the other things? Do we have the correct language? Do we have the people that we think have the discretion to enforce this policy? Do we have a good policy? Is our policy shaped well enough that it can move people's discretion in the right way? All of those things are issues of enforcement, practical, on-the-ground experience, and we might find that this experiment is a terrible failure. We might. Or it might achieve the balancing that we're hoping for, or it might be someplace in the middle, right? Where it could be tweaked and improved. But that's the place that we came to in terms of our initial assessment. And as I said, we don't provide any stamps here, right? BCLA approved. We don't. What we do is, I hope, a lot less public yelling than is kind of the talk radio rhetoric, and more attempting to move something forward in terms of a discussion. So in being invited to talk to the library community about how we assess this particular issue, one of the things that we're hopeful of is that, one, we can keep this going in terms of finding out, is this the right term? Because if it isn't, then again, we want to be able to say, well, not good enough, not good enough. If we're chilling expression unduly to achieve this other good, if we haven't demonstrated that we are achieving another good, right? Again, this is based on a very loose kind of evidence, that there is a user group that is having difficulty accessing the library because of the prevalence of these kinds of images. I don't suggest that that is ubiquitous across all libraries. If that is not the experience in any given library, then maybe this policy should be looked at. Maybe this is not a solution because it's not a problem that exists. If this is the problem that exists, this may be the solution, it may not be the solution. We're kind of a little bit in an experimental place. And we don't want to say that we have the answer, because I'm not sure that we do. we've tried to be as honest as we can about things that we didn't know, right? Number one thing I didn't know, everybody in the library is not a librarian. I didn't know that. I didn't know that, and I taught at Slace. I just assumed everybody in the library was a librarian. Who wasn't wearing a security guard uniform, okay? Right? I didn't know that. So this question of being asked, again, honing this discussion, right? Well, who do you think should enforce it? I go, well, you know, the librarians. Well, sometimes there's not even a librarian on the floor. What? I said, what? No librarians in the library? I mean, again, this is news to us. So this question of, you know, what the assumptions that go into this and what it's actually going to look like on the ground. This is always where the rubber hits the road, right? You come up with a nice little model. Well, in theory, it looks like this, right? In reality, it could look very different. And you want to make sure that you're basically reality testing these policies all the time, in particular this kind of policy. Because this kind of policy goes to the heart of the mandate of the library. Of course it's contentious. Libraries, we're contentious. But the idea that we are shifting away from something that we used to have, depending on where you were, never uncontentious, but we used to arguably accommodate better. Arguably we did. One of the things that has come again to our attention around this, and we say, well, what's changed then? What's changed? One of the things that's changed is screens are no longer this big. Now they're this big, right? It's increasingly difficult to be discreet about what's on your screen, right? The sheer size of the computer. So these are the kinds of things, again, when you change some factor, you change all the factors around it in terms of the analyses. So now how does this look? Now what constitutes an appropriate response? So computers have changed. The amount of computers have changed. Where computers live in a library, where there used to be, remember, just a few, because mostly it was books. My version of the library has mostly books. But now you're seeing these banks of computers, right? These huge banks of computers. Again, not something you're able to, if that's your configuration and that's your resource endowment, you're making that commitment to having those computers there. Once you've got them there, well, you're not going to have enough corners to put them discreetly along any given wall. They're going to be in these big banks. And again, now you have a visual spatial problem that is different than you might have had before. All of this has to be factored in. All of it has to be factored in because if you're going to say anything else, you're not dealing with the reality of libraries right here, right now. So that's where we came to. And I've probably talked enough for setting out a basic framework. What I'd like to do is I'd like to hear about what you think about this, hear about whether your library experience is any different, whether or not you've got thoughts about anything in relation to this, including process. Like, hey, you know what would have been good if you would have done X, Y, or Z? That would have helped us as a community. Want to hear that? Want to hear about what you'd like to see happen now. And especially if you have ideas about how this can be measured, evaluated, somehow responded to appropriately to see if it does what we think it's going to do. Again, which is put this together in a way that honors two public goods and two competing user groups. How are we going to know? What kind of baseline data might we need or might we have that would give us some form of basis of analysis for this? So that we're not talking out our hats, my theory and your theory, so that we actually have something that we can work with here to find out whether we need this at all, or whether we actually maybe need something as robust as what we're thinking of here in terms of a solution to an actual problem. How are we going to know? I want to know that. I want to know a lot of things. But first I'm going to invite up Dale because he's going to help me have this discussion with you.
This is not a question and answer period. This is a continuation of the conversation that we started. And I'm simply here to help facilitate that conversation. And because most of you are facing this way, we're going to have the conversation come up here and then respond to that conversation here. So, first of all, is there any comments to a really fine explanation of the challenges of trying to meet two different interests or two different goods as expressed or as viewed by library user groups?
Oh, I stumbled.
Yes.
Just wondering, one I sort of tried to make on the list for that, and what I don't hear being considered here is there's a lot of talk about things as being kind of the same thing as not before the book on the shelf, and you address that change. But there is also, I think, a change, and I work most of the time overseeing. People are using their computers to apply for jobs, file government forms, just do basic stuff like communicate with friends and family, just basic user activities. But it seems to me more and more, I mean, the BC government just had a survey asking if parents want to have communication with teachers to be done primarily through the internet. So from a digital divide perspective, a social justice perspective, equality of opportunity, I find that kind of disturbing. It seems to me like that shift in what people are doing at the library changes this. It's not really accurate to just characterize it as offense or offensiveness, if that is what people are there to do. The comparison I try to use is think of something, and most of us don't go to the public library to do those basic things. We, do it from our home computer. We go into an office, we sit down with a banker or whatever. We don't have to face it kind of. So I'm just wondering if there's any conflict. Put it succinctly. Was there any consideration of this, like along the lines of being like hostile environment or captive audience or some of those ways that we think about it in terms of say the workplace?
Yeah.
The library has lots of things to do.
Sure. Let me say a couple of things about that. So, just for the purposes of the camera, because your entire very cogent discussion was not captured there. One of the questions, a quick summary, an incomplete summary of what's just been asked, is this question of, because people are using computers in a different fashion, increasingly doing daily activities that they would have had in their homes, checking their mail, now electronically, digitally mediated life. People are using their computers in a kind of a digital divide way. People are relying on computers in libraries in ways that they might not have before and using them for different tasks. Is the demographic that's being discussed in terms of computer usage something that we took into account? Is that a fair summary? Or
well, I don't think it necessarily has to be demographic, and the demographic is pretty diverse, so it can be, like people I help at the library, people who just never bought a computer, are older, the library is a comfortable place to come in and learn how to use this thing that's kind of central to their life. Right. And to communicate with them, they could be quite well off. But I think for them too, it matters whether it's, to characterize it as just a offense. I guess the internet is becoming it's becoming a public utility that people need. If there's a possibility, I mean, like I agree with you, I don't know what the evidence is. I couldn't find anything, laying it out in terms of any aggregated studies or anything. But I'm not really talking about the demographics, it's just what people are using computers for, and it's kind of public utility that they need to be a kind of a full participant in to be on equal footing as participants in society.
Yeah. No, I don't think there's going to be too much disagreement with the increasing centrality of having a computer available to you to participate. I think, and I'm one of those people who doesn't have a home computer, by the way. I have used the computer in the library to check my Hotmail. I'm a privacy advocate with a Hotmail account. Yeah, I know. Life's like that, right? We all make these trade-offs. But I think that we can acknowledge, and I think it is something that should be part of the formulation as we look at this issue about computers are not going away. Because we're concerned about the digital divide, we want those computers in those libraries. People have a need to access them. Libraries are the last indoor public space. One of the places we want people to be able to access services like this. So we're not getting any fewer computers. That's true, right? That's not going to diminish anytime soon, probably the other direction. The usage of it has changed, obviously, as it becomes more central in our lives, but I don't think the issue that we are presenting, or that is presented to us in this conundrum, which is specifically sexually explicit, or I'm going to use the vernacular and just say porn, right? I don't think the concerns around porn and user groups access is really that different, even if the computers are being accessed in a whole bunch of other different ways, right? So we are using computers for more things. More people are using computers because they need to. I think the call on the computers has increased because of that centrality, but I don't think it changes. I mean, because you're going to check your email doesn't necessarily implicate sexually explicit imagery, unless that's what you're going to do on the computer, and that would have been true anyhow. Does that make sense?
I just think that you're characterizing it as a defense, but just to be a little more specific, like what I thought about the policy, and I don't think, so it's an interesting point you said that it was not this is what was going on, but I thought that it could be that the motivation was something like, and the reason it focuses on sexual material and not violent material,
Right.
Justification for that could be that this is not making the library a sexist environment.
Oh,
That
okay.
excludes people. And then, but if you put that in the policy, there's no sexist visual material, that would be very hard from a kind of surveillance point of view. You would have to be really like looking at people and scrutinizing the way that you not want, right?
Yeah, we're not going there.
So if you go for a broader category and there would be some collateral damage, then you would try to ameliorate that.
Okay, we've got some other people to talk to, but let me just say quickly, because I think I missed an element of what you were saying before. We did not assess this at all. No part of our analyses is a workplace harassment analysis. We did not look at this from the perspective of, do librarians have a right not to X, Y, or Z? We are analyzing this from the public's perspective, from a public goods perspective, that excludes any possibility of employer liability, human rights in the workplace in terms of staff. We are taking at least prima facie, the preliminary position that it is a librarian's obligation to deal with all kinds of offensive material, right? And so we did not assess that, again, from that particular perspective. Other people have brought that particular aspect of the discussion up. It was no part of our analyses. We were looking at public goods outside of the human resources aspect of this question.
Thank you, Michael. Next question, yes.
I was going to say, just a concern I have about the spatial solution was that we sort of segregating computers and sort of saying, oh, this is the street usage area. Does that put a bit of a chilling effect in terms of, oh, those are the poor computers?
Yes. I mean, it's a real question, Oh, hello. That's actually fine what you're doing. You might want to go into the porn bit, though. Yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem, right? I mean, how you would go about doing that is, basically it's a little bit vexed. It's a little bit vexed. But in terms of essentially providing an arena, again, a spatial arena, and how you would do that in a non-stigmatized manner, also would need some looking at. I agree with you.
Yes.
I totally agree with Gwen. Listening to you, I feel smarter.
That was so nice.
could be, when you were saying you thought that everyone worked in a library was a librarian, I think there, you might have another assumption that may not be correct, that all librarians, even though intellectual freedom is a core value of our profession, that we have training in it, that we study it in school or have that training in the workplace. I'm just curious, who here's a librarian? And who here took a course during the degree on intellectual freedom? So I think there's also a bigger problem about education and staff training to put those decisions in the hand of a librarian who may or may not understand what intellectual freedom means, what that means in the current environment where so much information is digital. And then if we're also not training that as part of staff training or like hiring new people, that's a problem. So I think as a profession we have a big gap there.
Thank you for that.
I'd like to comment on
Yeah.
that. I do think, though, a lot of our training as librarians, and I wasn't a trained public librarian, but I was a trained school librarian. A lot of intellectual freedom issues get diffused with other issues that we learn and other training that we get, so that it kind of permeates our souls as we get trained for a library. So it may not be explicit, but it almost comes with the territory.
That wasn't my experience. I guess I graduated 8 years ago, so maybe the curriculum has changed. But
Mine was more than 30 years.
So there were no courses offered at UBC when I was there on intellectual freedom. And even though it does permeate kind of all like collections and reference service, if we say it's a core value, we should be investing some of our education time and some of our staff training time kind of figuring out what that means.
Right. For the benefit of the people who have the camera posed at us and not the audience, there are a lot of heads nodding around this discussion about inculcating more thoroughly a culture of intellectual freedom within library education and professional development. Yes?
Yeah.
Further contributions to the conversation. Yes.
I'd like to ask about or kind of challenge the two user groups. Like, it's kind of been set up that there's a group of people who go into the library and use computers to see porn, and there's a group of people who go into the library and are upset by seeing people use porn. But in my experience, there's many things that upset people. And I'm curious about why we would privilege, be it as they are, that you've got a big group of people who are offended by porn and smaller groups of people who are offended by other things. But that was actually one of my first reactions to reading about the BPL policy is this privileges aversion to sexual imagery, but does not honor the many other things that people are likely to be upset about or offended by. And like Joe mentioned a few things in terms of violence. I personally, if I were in a workplace and forced to watch out for Hitchcock's film The Birds, like if someone were playing that film in my sight line day after day or minute after minute, like I would have a hard time functioning. I'm seriously would.
Right.
And I don't expect, like if I'm in a public space and that's happening, I feel like it is my responsibility to get out of there. Like I don't feel like I should go and ask somebody, please make that person stop watching the thing that is making me crazy. But I think, but then when I hear, oh, but you are going to do that for the people who are being made crazy by porn, so why is that? Hey.
Right. Okay, this is, so one of the things that I heard in this discussion, because this is not the first time that this has come up, right? Hey, what's with these people, right? One of the things that I heard in having a discussion about, well, what if I won't use the library? I'm going to take my child out of this arena in the library because you're showing some, graphic beheading video you're watching. It's horrible. I can't be here, right? So I asked librarians, what would you do if somebody came up and said, I can't be here because this is was happening, they said, well, we would have a discrete discussion with that person. That's typically what I've heard, right? So these kinds of occasions in which this happened, asking if someone would just be alive to the fact that there was concerns in the arena, right, in the area, were happening when they happened, but they were rare, right? So what I was hearing on this discussion of, is it really that we have, you know, hordes of people leaving or making complaints or anxious about having their children and young people using the computers around all of these other things that could be seen to be offensive? The answer was, well, no. It's almost invariably form. So it was addressing the problem that exists, as opposed to, because there seemed to be a more relaxed attitude, or not relaxed, but a less conflicted ability to approach people who were watching something that was violent and upsetting people nearby, than if it was porn. That's just the feedback that we got. Is that your experience, or is it not your experience? It sounds like it cannot be your experience, or you would not be saying this. You have people who, equal numbers or as significant a component of people who feel like they can't use the library because of other concerns of graphic nature.
No, I think the largest user group who is leaving because they're offended by what other people are doing on the internet are the people who are offended by porn. I will grant that.
Okay.
I just, it disturbs me that that's the only, that is the thing that is privileged, or that
Right.
is, or that we as library staff are called upon to intervene in that situation, but not in other situations, or that we would be quietly having a little discussion about the beheadings, but we would be outlining the porn, like.
So you feel like librarians would be better off if they were empowered with a more broad policy that talked about, well, here's the problem. Does it get too fuzzy if we say, hey, our policy is to accommodate user groups within the arena? Does that shape discretion enough or too little? Does that empower librarians in an appropriate way to deal with things, in your
I
view?
totally agree that we need to have a means so that people are not leaving because they're offended by what other people are doing. Like, I'm there.
Okay.
Okay. But I'm just, where I get a little crazy is when we are colluding with, or when what we're doing is simply latching on to the one big thing. And I don't know, I mean, maybe this is simply my thing as a collections librarian. I want the broadest possible range of materials to be in the library, and I don't want anyone, I want it to be balanced, and I don't want anyone to be overpowering any other.
Right.
And so, I mean, maybe what you're saying to me is, well, you know, actually, Miriam, you're a little bit nuts here because the only thing anyone does care about is porn, and why don't you?
That's not what I was hoping to say. Miriam is my friend. If I were going to tell you were nuts, I'd do that privately. I don't think you're nuts. I mean, it's part of it. You know, as I said, we're quite dissatisfied of this notion. It's like it's sexually explicit imagery, right? If there is a broader problem, then we would want to privilege. We would want to make sure that we weren't privileging some aspect of this. If we have a broader problem, because it would mean in principle, there's another aspect. If we accept the analysis, there's another user group who is being disadvantaged because there's no means of redress. What we've heard is that librarians often do make these kinds of interventions, but if there's better language to get at what the motivation is behind all of this, which is not, you know, kind of erotic phobia, right? It's not what we're at here, people. It's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to judge your usage of this. We're trying to balance user groups within this space. So if there's better language to say that, then we're keen to say it, I think. And so I don't know, you might be onto something here in terms of a way to get around the problem of we've got to, we're stuck with sexually explicit and we don't like it. Maybe we should just start from something a little more core. I'm not sure.
So let's just change the conversation a little bit. Beside Miriam, the gentleman there, you had your hand up for a comment.
Well, it was kind of connected to Miriam.
Okay, that's fine.
But I just connected to Miriam's. I have a problem with the document that was released, some of the wording that it would offend women and children, like all women and children are offended by pornography. The BCL document. And that, as Miriam says, of your user groups, the one who wants to use porn, the one who doesn't, it's almost assumed, why did they go with the one who wants to use porn? Because they're not coming to the library. Do we not care about them?
Sorry, say that again.
So you got your two user groups, the
Yep.
ones who are offended by porn, the ones who want to use the porn.
Right.
Why is the automatic default to stop the ones who want to access porn? Is it okay to stop them from the information to you?
Well, again, here's the issue. Are we stopping or are we limiting the
You're
ability
stopping if you say no sexually explicit material.
on the internet? Right?
It's still that's one of the main mediums.
It has become so
It's probably the main medium. So you're essentially stopping porn.
in the
And-
library.
In the library. So why is that user group second to the people who are offended? Why is that the automatic default?
In terms of the ability to use the space, right? What the access issue is, how can we best modulate this? You have the ability to use just about everything else on the internet, except this one thing, right? Trying to narrow down and again, it could be all you care about on the internet, in which case it's a very big thing, even if you say it's narrow, right? So I appreciate the problem around that line. The issue is, do you want to say, hey, and I don't know if let's take a Boy Scout jamboree, so we're not there, neither women nor girls, right? But just young men who, for whatever reason, the usual reason, not in a place of sufficient maturity to deal with a kind of an imagery. And I know you're saying, yeah, except they've been looking at it since they're 5, right? Yeah, but that's not everyone. It really isn't. And from the sense of saying, is it unreasonable to say, I don't want my 11-year-old child exposed to this violent pornography? Is that unreasonable, right? One of the user groups that we are dealing with here in terms of affective vulnerability is, I'm sorry, young people. It is. And so in terms of weighing this, they may not actually be equal. And you can say the kinds of people who might need to use or require public internet access to view porn are a very disadvantaged group. They're probably not they don't have a computer in their house, or this is a very strange activity for them to be undertaking. So they too are a disadvantaged group, right? We really can make these arguments. All I can say is, we thought as much as we could about what was at issue here, and in terms of saying, what is the place where we can get some kind of meeting? That's what we came up with. But I don't think it's fair to say we just wrote off everyone who might want to use porn. Again, the idea was, if you don't have to go to that place, don't go there. If you have the ability to put a computer in a place where that can be accessed, do that. If you have the ability to put up a computer screen, a privacy screen that will allow that to happen without this conflict occurring, do that. So all I can say is, in terms of, at least in our view, we didn't write off that route and say, yeah, you go out the window and you people are it. right?
Yeah.
This is an attempt to try to fix them, to put them together, and I do realize there's a bit of a head-on collision here. So,
I've dealt with a lot of intellectual freedom issues, and they often always start with will children see this?
mhm.
With books or videos or anything else. So I have a real problem that that's used. Also, asking them to move somewhere else. You could also ask the person who doesn't want to see it to move somewhere else.
Unless they also need a computer.
Yeah, so but what
Right?
I'm saying is that argument goes both ways.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, I don't want to intercept your,
Jackie, you had your hand up for a comment for continuing the
Yeah,
conversation.
when Miriam, I think it was raising her issues, my mind was wandering because I was hearing that there was some kind of a wanting to broaden the issue beyond what we're actually talking about, and the whole issue of what is offensive to some and not offensive to others. And I have many things that I find offensive that others may not. And that's a whole other 2 days worth of discussion.
right.
But it's also a big part of this issue, for me at least.
Yeah.
So to broaden that discussion even further.
Well, I'm not keen, as I say, we're
on
trying to
narrow-
keep things narrow
Yeah,
because
I
we're talking about a
understand that.
content
Yeah.
restriction,
Yes.
and we're already a little mortified about that, right?
Yeah.
You know, so we're not looking forward to expanding content restrictions. What I'm suggesting, and perhaps kind of spurred by Miriam's comment, is a sense of maybe our language could be a little more explicit about what it is we're attempting to do, which is honor the ability for user groups to essentially be in this space to the degree that that can be possible with this schism. Again, trying to keep it tight, but to use language that makes it clear that it is not a vendetta against porn, right? That it's not some kind of value judgment that the library is making, that it is something about the user groups. I think there's something in that, but I would have to really think it through to offer up anything.
And to look for fixes that are the least restrictive that they can be, and to go there
Yeah.
first, whatever the subject may be. David?
Yeah, so Michael, you asked, where does the conversation go from here? So the only piece I just wanted to add was one step that has been taken is from the Intellectual Freedom Committee. Some people got together and we talked about having a project where people can come together and kind of deal with the 2-day, multiple-hour amount of work of finding different types of language and then kind of seeing what can come up from the number of months it'll take to find different ways of saying how can we tackle this problem. That's one way that the community is responding. But again, I sent an email out about that and we're kind of lost in the email land. I wondered what do people think about this approach to carrying this conversation beyond the evening and having a way of coming together and grappling with what text might be preferable, what phrasing has strengths, because I feel like it always comes down to language, and that's one of the things that fires me up about these issues, is finding those better sentences or those different ways of speaking. So responding to your question, that's one thing that's happening, and then turning to my colleagues, are there other things that we could be doing, or what did you think of this approach to having this online space where we compare research and try to come up with different ways to handle it as a larger problem?
Are you asking the IFC to brainstorm better language around censorship? That's what I'm hearing.
Well, I mean,
like a better way to say no sexually explicit material or no porn or.
No, I think more.
I think like it's a problematic issue.
Yeah, I think it's more always being able to say, here's a sentence that perhaps could go to another party that addresses it better, and just constantly going back and forth to see what other ways could things be phrased to further acknowledge the challenges, the intellectual freedom challenges that do exist. So I'm just looking for ways to have different types of policy worded that we still feel good about from an intellectual freedom perspective.
Yes.
I want to go back to something that you said in response to Miriam's point about different people being offended